Right now, for the first time in decades, there is not a single American aircraft carrier anywhere in the Western Pacific. Not one. Sit with that for a second, because it is not a rumor. It is not a leak. It is a plain fact reported openly this week, and it tells you more about the actual state of American power than anything happening on a battlefield in the Middle East. The reason there's no carrier covering the Pacific is simple. The war with Iran ate it, and the country watching that gap open up, quietly, patiently, without firing a shot, is China. This is the story almost nobody is connecting properly, so let's connect it properly. On one side of the planet, the United States is locked into an open-ended war with Iran that has already run for months longer than anyone in Washington expected. On the other side of the planet, the One Theater American strategy has spent 20 years calling the most important long-term challenge the country faces, the Pacific, just went unguarded. Not because anyone chose that outcome, because there was no choice left to make. You cannot keep a carrier group in two oceans at once when one of those oceans is consuming your ships faster than you can rotate them home. Here's how this actually happened, step by step, because the sequence matters more than the headline. The USS Abraham Lincoln left San Diego late last year, originally meant for routine Pacific operations. Within weeks, it was redirected toward the Middle East as the fighting with Iran intensified, and it never really left. Its deployment kept getting extended, month after month, well past the point any previous carrier crew had ever been asked to stay at sea continuously. By the middle of this month, it had logged somewhere around 260 days deployed, with more than 240 of those days spent continuously at sea. Almost no port calls, almost no real rest for the thousands of sailors and Marines living on it. Reports of serious strain aboard that ship, mental health concerns, supply and morale problems, serious enough that lawmakers started publicly demanding answers, eventually forced the Pentagon's hand. The only way to relieve the Lincoln was to send another carrier to replace it. And the only carrier available to send was the USS George Washington, which had been stationed in the Pacific. So it left. It sailed west, out of the region it was supposed to be defending, to go plug a hole in a war that was never supposed to last this long. And for the first time since anyone can remember, the Western Pacific, the waters around Taiwan, around the Philippines, around Japan and South Korea, was left without a single American carrier group. Analysts who watch this region for a living didn't hesitate to say what that means. One defense analyst pointed out plainly that this gives Beijing a clean opportunity to demonstrate to everyone watching, the Philippines, Japan, Indonesia, that the United States isn't the dominant power in the Western Pacific the way it used to be. Nobody seriously thinks China invades Taiwan tomorrow because a carrier sailed away. That's not how this works, and it's not the point. The point is quieter and more corrosive than an invasion. Every ally in that region, every government that built its entire defense posture around the assumption that American ships would be there when it mattered, just watched that assumption fail a real-world test. Not in theory, not in a war game, in practice, right now, while everyone was looking somewhere else. This is what a two-front trap actually looks like when it's working. Nobody has to plan it perfectly. Nobody even has to intend for both fronts to open at once. Iran didn't need to coordinate anything with Beijing to make this happen. All Iran needed to do was make the war expensive enough, long enough, that Washington's own logistics did the rest. And that's exactly what's been happening in the skies over the Gulf for months now, quietly bleeding the exact kind of hardware and personnel endurance that a two-ocean strategy depends on. Look at what's actually been lost fighting this one war, because the numbers by themselves tell the story better than any analysis can. The United States has lost roughly 45 Reaper drones since this conflict began, something close to a quarter of the entire fleet it had going into the war. That's not a fleet. America can simply reorder from a factory floor, because the production line for that particular drone was already shut down before the war even started. Every one of those losses is permanent. Multiply that out, and the taxpayer bill on drones alone runs past $1 billion. And that's before counting the fighters, the tankers, the helicopters, the surveillance planes that independent trackers following this war put somewhere north of 100 aircraft lost or damaged across the whole campaign. None of that shows up as a single dramatic headline. It shows up as a slow accumulation, one loss at a time, easy to explain away individually and almost impossible to explain away in total. And here's the part that connects directly back to that empty stretch of ocean near Taiwan. A modern aircraft carrier deployment isn't just a ship. It's an ecosystem, fighter squadrons, refueling aircraft, escort ships, maintenance crews, drone surveillance assets, all of it needing to be resupplied, repaired, rotated, and rested on a schedule that simply cannot be stretched forever without something breaking. When you burn through drones and aircraft in one theater faster than you can replace them, and you extend a carrier's deployment past the point any crew was ever meant to endure, you're not just weakening that one theater. You're weakening the entire system's ability to be in two places at once. That's the two-front trap. It doesn't require China to do anything provocative. It just requires America's other war to run long enough that the math stops working. And Beijing understands this math better than almost anyone, because Beijing has spent the better part of 2 decades studying exactly how American power projection actually functions under strain. There's a reason Chinese officials weren't shy about calling the American presence in their region an obstacle to their long-term ambitions around Taiwan, and there's a reason analysts who track this closely describe Beijing as genuinely pleased watching Washington get pulled into distraction elsewhere, watching American allies in the Pacific grow unsettled about whether the security guarantees they've built entire national defense budgets around are actually going to hold when it counts. You don't need a leaked document to understand that logic. It's sitting right there in the open, described by people whose entire job is watching this exact dynamic for a living. Now here's where it gets more specific and more uncomfortable, because the drain on American assets happening in the Gulf isn't happening by accident either. Iran didn't develop the capability to shoot down a quarter of America's drone fleet on its own. Not at this pace, not this efficiently. A meaningful part of what's grinding down American low-altitude air operations over Iran right now is cheap, shoulder-fired, infrared, guided defense equipment that Chinese suppliers have been getting into Iranian hands. This isn't some exotic, headline-grabbing superweapon. It's small enough for 2 or 3 people to carry, easy to conceal, easy to fire and disappear with before anyone can trace where the shot came from, and devastatingly effective against exactly the kind of low, slow surveillance and reconnaissance flights that any sustained air campaign depends on. You cannot bomb your way out of a threat that's dispersed across dozens of small teams instead of concentrated in one radar installation you can target from the air. Which means the same country supplying the equipment that's grinding down American air power in one ocean is the same country benefiting most directly from the resulting gap in another ocean. That's not a coincidence you need a conspiracy theory to explain. It's simple strategic patience. China doesn't need to win a war against the United States to benefit from this moment. China just needs the United States to keep being the kind of power that gets pulled fully into one crisis at a time, while everything China actually cares about, Taiwan, the South China Sea, the loyalty of nervous allies watching to see who actually shows up when it matters, quietly shifts in its favor. There's an economic layer sitting underneath all of this too, and it deserves its own moment, because it's the part that connects directly to how long any of this can actually be sustained. While American carriers are stretched thin defending shipping lanes and American drones are getting shot down over the Gulf, Chinese refineries have continued taking in discounted Iranian crude, oil that can't easily move through official channels because of sanctions, sold at a markdown that makes it attractive to exactly the kind of buyer who isn't worried about upsetting Washington. Every barrel of that oil represents a transaction happening entirely outside the reach of American financial pressure, and every one of those transactions strengthens the exact kind of parallel economic relationships that reduce how much leverage sanctions actually carry over time. None of that requires China to take a single public side in this war. It requires China to do what it's already doing, quietly, patiently, at scale, while everyone's attention stays fixed on the more dramatic footage coming out of the Gulf. Meanwhile, back home, the cost of all of this isn't abstract either. Gas prices in the United States have been sitting stubbornly above levels that make voters uncomfortable. Shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has been running at a small fraction of what it was before the war started. And every extra week this drags on adds pressure to a political clock that has nothing to do with military strategy and everything to do with an election calendar. That pressure doesn't stay contained to domestic politics. It shapes what decisions get made abroad, because a government under pressure to show strength at home doesn't always make the decision that's actually best for its broader global position. Sometimes it makes the decision that looks best on television that night, even if the strategic cost gets paid somewhere else, in some other ocean, months later. So step back and look at the entire shape of this. In one theater, a war that was supposed to be contained and relatively short has instead ground on for the better part of a year, consuming aircraft, drones, and crew endurance faster than any of it can be replaced. In another theater, the One American strategy has spent 2 decades calling the true long-term priority, the actual physical presence meant to deter a much larger and more consequential conflict has, for the first time in years, simply disappeared. Not through defeat, not through combat, but through the ordinary mechanics of a military that can only stretch so far. And watching both of those things happen at once, without lifting a finger to cause either one directly, is a country that has spent this entire period selling cheap, effective, hard-to-trace defense equipment into the first conflict while quietly buying discounted oil and biding time on the second. That is what a two-front trap actually looks like in the real world. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a dramatic declaration or a single decisive battle. It comes with a carrier quietly sailing out of an ocean it was supposed to be guarding, a drone fleet quietly shrinking past the point it can be rebuilt, and a rival power quietly doing absolutely nothing except paying close, patient attention. The uncomfortable question nobody in the official briefings wants to ask out loud is not whether America can still win the war it's currently fighting. It's whether America can afford to keep fighting it at the pace it's currently being fought, while the ocean it always said mattered most sits open, watched, and unguarded, for exactly as long as it takes for someone on the other side of it to decide that patience has paid off. Watch what happens to that Pacific carrier gap in the coming weeks, because how quickly it gets filled again will tell you more about the real state of American military bandwidth than any statement out of the Pentagon. Watch whether the pace of losses over Iran speeds up or slows down, because that curve is the clearest signal of whether this war is becoming more sustainable or less. Watch how Beijing behaves around Taiwan during exactly this window, because a power that studies opportunity as carefully as this one does rarely announces its intentions in advance. It simply acts when the moment looks right and explains itself afterward. And watch, more than anything, whether Washington starts talking seriously about an exit from the Iran war, or whether the political cost of looking weak at home keeps outweighing the strategic cost of staying stretched too thin abroad, because that choice, more than any single battle in either ocean, is the one that will actually decide how this two-front trap ends. Nobody forced the United States into fighting two fronts at once. That's the part we're sitting with longest. No enemy planned this convergence with a map and a calendar. It happened because one war ran long, because one ocean got emptied out to cover for another, and because the country best positioned to benefit from exactly that kind of overstretch has spent years patiently preparing to notice it the moment it happened. China didn't force this trap open. It simply waited for the door to swing shut on its own, and it's still standing there, watching while it does.